You're watching the award-winning GHS-TV, a nationally recognized student television station.
Sunday, September 15th, 1963. A bomb explodes in a church in Birmingham, Alabama. 4 little girls are killed.
We couldn't believe they would kill children getting ready for Sunday school. I guess it shouldn't have been a shock.
The bomb was planted by the Ku Klux Klan. Earlier that year, young protesters marching from the church had attracted the attention of the nation by braving fire hoses, police dogs, and jail to break the stranglehold of segregation in the city. Now, 4 are dead.
The Ku Klux Klan could do anything they want to you. And to know that could happen to you, I was kind of scared. And I think I was kind of angry too.
Activists who helped organize the young protesters are devastated. To honor the 4 girls and transform Alabama, they urged Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to start a voting rights campaign in the state. 90 miles away in Selma, high school students are already taking a stand.
I don't consider myself a civil rights leader. I sort of consider myself a foot soldier. We were the ones who did the hard work while other people were busy providing other forms of leadership. I think it's very appropriate that my background wasn't mentioned, because what was unique about the civil rights movement is that it wasn't one individual who made the movement, it was an entire community. As a matter of fact, on Bloody Sunday, there were about 600 people who marched that day. And 3 years ago, the Congress of the United States dedicated a congressional medal to those 600 people who marched on Bloody Sunday. And it wasn't an individual award, it was a joint award, and I think that's very appropriate. And that's why I think that anybody who claims personal credit for something that a community did is missing the point. There are people who are, there are different types of leaders, and I'd like to compliment you on the position that you're taking. As I was thinking about the term facing history, facing ourselves, it sort of made me reflect on a time when I was about your age. You know, I was basically committed to being a student just like you are. Nothing in particular on my mind except day-to-day activities, no real commitment, just mundane things. And a civil rights movement started, and I faced that history, and it changed me forever. I started off not being very committed to my studies. Although I was a pretty good student, I didn't put a lot of effort into it because it came easy to me. And I didn't see that as a pathway to anywhere else. One of the pitfalls of a segregated system is it basically cuts you off at the head and it kills your ambitions. That is the worst thing that can happen to somebody. I was always a curious person, and that curiosity is probably what got me involved in the civil rights movement originally, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And one of the worst things about segregation to me is that I could not look at the world without being possibly punished to do that. You could not become a fully functioning human being when you could not express yourself, when you could not develop yourself, where you could not pursue your ambitions, and you could not look to see what was around you and take advantage of those opportunities that were given to you to become a more fully functioning human being. That was the worst part of the segregation for me. I hadn't anticipated that you guys would see this film, so it tells a lot about. That was me. Those were my classmates. Those were my friends. Those are the people I grew up with. That is the type of lifestyle I put up with and had to live in. It was sort of like growing up in an outdoor prison, you know. Every part of your life that was significant was controlled by somebody else. That's what segregation does to you. It tells you that you're inferior, and sooner or later, if you're told that long enough, you, whether you fight against it or not, you internalize a lot of that, and it really robs you of your spirit, your potential, and it robs you of yourself potentially. One of the fortunate things that happened in Selma is there was a guy by the name of Bernard Lafayette. You saw a picture of him there. One of the greatest advantages of my youth was meeting people like him. Of course, I met people like what was called Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture is his African name. I met people like Ivanhoe Donaldson. These are people you probably don't know: Lafayette Cerny, Terry Shaw, Cleophas Hobbs, many, many other people. And they had a very important formative effect on who I am now. That's why that facing history, facing yourself is so poignant to me. Having an opportunity to be a part of a very important historical movement and meeting the icons of that movement. And at that time, they weren't icons. They were just people you knew. They were just like your friends in here. And because they made a certain commitment to facing history, they found themselves going deeper and deeper into themselves and finding themselves. One of the things that has happened to me is that I started off not very committed to anything in particular. I was sort of the type of person that I'm sort of a get along or let along. And at one point, I had to make a decision about whether I would commit myself to the civil rights movement. One of the dangers of committing yourself to the civil rights movement is that as an individual commitment, it's very dangerous. It's irrational because the forces against you are very hostile and they're very powerful, and they have all of the power of the state to oppose you. So as individuals, it doesn't make good sense to confront that directly. But what happens is you develop a movement, you develop an insular situation, you begin to develop protection for yourself, and you encourage each other, you support each other, and you have an opportunity to expand yourself more, and it makes you more courageous, more brave, makes you willing to take those risks, and the willingness to overcome that individual intimidation that was constant and begin to combine as a community. That's why I said joint awards are appropriate in situations like that, because as an individual, you're not strong, but as a group, as a community, there's great strength. And that was one of the most important things we learned about the civil rights movement. Bernard Lafayette had been a part of, he had been a part of the Nashville movement. Does anybody know what the Nashville movement is all about? It was about desegregating lunch counters. During that time, about 1961, people could not go into the equivalent at that time of McDonald's and Hardee's and get a soda or a hamburger. Blacks were not allowed to do that. The students in Nashville ended up protesting that, demonstrating that, being beat, being spit on, being kicked, and eventually succeeded in winning that struggle, and that was the beginning of the movement in Nashville. Bernard Lafayette also went on to help develop the Student Nonviolent, to found the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Do anybody know what that is? SNCC, yes. When the movement first started, it was basically run by a group called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was a group of ministers who basically started in the Montgomery movement. And then after the success of the Montgomery movement, they went over to Atlanta and started a Southern Christian leadership organization that became SCLC. And it sort of became the titular head of the civil rights movement in the South. Many students were involved in that, but in every generation, there are generational conflicts. You have your way of doing things, and old folks have their way of doing things. And it was realized that young people like yourselves needed an organization of their own to express their particular way of strategies and tactics. Ella Baker, who was an old SNCC worker, advocated for them, and out of that advocation came the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. What was different about SNCC and SCLC is that SCLC was top to bottom. Dr. King could come in, bring a lot of money, bring a lot of attention, could bring the press, and a lot of good things got done as a result of that. But SNCC would come in and start at the bottom, and they would stay at the bottom and encourage people who were not literate, encourage people who were farmers, encourage people who could not fill out a voter certificate form to basically do that. And I think that had SNCC's, the young people's approach to social organizing persisted, then we would have had a more consistent and a more widespread success during the time of civil rights. But Bernard Lafayette was one of those people who helped to found this organization, and that was part of his brilliance. He was also part of the Freedom Riders. In the early 1960s, about 1961, I think it was, the Interstate Commerce Act passed. And although it was a law that said that everybody who took public transportation, whether it a train or a bus, had the right to be treated equally as they traveled throughout the country. It was a law, but it was not being implemented. People like Bernard, Congressman John Lewis, others got together, boarded buses, places like DC, and decided throughout the South to test that law. They were beat, their buses were burned, they were threatened to be killed. Those are the type of things that the people who came before me and before you did in order to give you the opportunity to sit here now and to appreciate the freedoms that you have. I sometimes say that there's been an evolution from people being colored to Negro to Afro to Black. And it's been the courage of those people who came before us who have encouraged that continuum forward. And that continuum still exists. But it was their blood, sweat, and tears that allowed you to sit and have the privilege you have now because of the sacrifice they made then. And therefore, the onus is on you to carry that torch forward, because we've sort of done our part. And I have to compliment us. We did a pretty good job. Note also is that the onus is on you now, and I have absolute faith that you will do the same thing. I have complete confidence that, because there was nothing extraordinary about us, what we did was just to simply respond to the times just like you're going to do. And you have no choice, because you'll have to identify the issues that confront you and to challenge those issues and not give in to them. It's your time to make America great again, you know. You know, and we know what that means, you know. But it was people like Bernard Lafayette who influenced me and probably put me on the path that I'm on now. And I never would have thought that. And what is so significant about that is that I went from being only partially committed to, you know, I have some other responsibilities today, some very serious responsibilities, and I won't discuss them with you because they're private. But like, I was, whenever I get a chance to tell you how much faith I have in people like yourselves and how important it is that you express that, that talent that you have, I always take advantage, regardless of what sacrifice I have to make to do that, to make sure that you hear those words. There was nothing special about us, but we did extraordinary things. And also, you don't have to be special yourself to do extraordinary things, but you have to put one foot in front of the other and never quit. That's what the Civil Rights Movement taught us. It wasn't that we did great things every day, it's just that we did ordinary things every day, and it led to extraordinary things happening. I'm not sure if I want to recount it. You probably heard about what happened during the Civil Rights Movement, but Bernard Lafayette was committed to nonviolence. I'm sorry, I'm not normally used to speaking to so many people. I normally speak to, I normally have conversations. I'm not much into speaking to people. But Bernard, one night, saw two white guys out in front of his house, and they seemed to have been fixing a car, and they had their hood up. And so he went out, being a civil rights activist and a very generous person, went out to help them. What they did was, when Bernard looked under the hood, one of the guys took a blunt object and hit him in the head and gave him a concussion. And he had to move out of Selma. And he went back to, and plus his wife, Coley, at the time, was pregnant, so they took him out of Selma, and for a while we didn't have any national leadership. Sometime later, a guy by the name of James Orange. James Orange was about 6'5", 6'6", and about 250, 300 pounds. I think his uncle was the first black coach at Mississippi State. He was called the Gentle Giant. He had been a part of the Birmingham movement. The story was that how he got involved in civil rights, and this is true of a lot of guys in civil rights, is that he would go to 16th Street Baptist Church because all the cute girls would go there first. It's always the women who go to things that are responsible first, and the guys come to see y'all, and that's how they get caught and involved. But James Orange went to 16th Street Baptist Church basically to court the young ladies there. And the church was crowded, and he one night saw that there was a place in the middle where there were a lot of empty seats. So he went down and sort of sat in one of the empty seats. And after he had sat there for a while, it filled up. And as it filled up, the minister came up and said, "Well, I want to congratulate all of y'all, because these are the people who volunteered to demonstrate tomorrow, to confront Bull Connors." And so he was shocked and embarrassed, because he went there looking for a girlfriend and ended up finding out that he had made a commitment to join the Civil Rights Movement. He was so embarrassed that he stayed there, and he continued to do that for the rest of his life. But James is the person who came to Selma after Bernard, and he came to people like myself and said, "Let's create a student organization." And we met at Brown Chapel, where Dr. King spoke most of the time. And I was elected president of the Dallas County Youth League. This was the second phase of the Civil Rights Movement in Selma. The first stage had been with guys that you saw up here at first: Terry Shaw, Cleophas Hobbs, Evelyn Mann, Betty Fikes, people like that. They were the first phase of that movement. They had had some successes, but the mass successes of the Civil Rights Movement started with the Dallas County Youth League. The adults were not too busy marching. Like I said, it is always young people like yourselves who provide the leadership in situations like that. And the adults oftentimes follow in your footsteps, you know. And so if you're not moving, it's very unlikely that there's going to be any movement. That's why it's important that you understand how absolutely valuable you are in terms of bringing about social change. You have less to lose, and you are more committed to your values. And if it's not for the youth coming out, then there won't be any fire in the storm. But we ended up, under James's leadership, basically starting a mass movement that ended up being a part of Bloody Sunday. James Orange ended up going to about 27 miles north of Selma and was arrested there. One night, the state troopers decided that they would, there was a threat that they might very well take him out of prison at night and possibly kill him. The citizens of Marion went out at night to protect him. A riot ensued. The state troopers shot out the lights. They created a police riot. Jimmy Lee Jackson, a veteran, mother and father were involved in this. He tried to protect his mother and his grandfather. A state trooper shot him, and he became one of the martyrs of the movement. There were two other martyrs of the movement that were white, Reverend Reed and Jonathan Daniels. But the significance of Jimmy Lee's death was that we had a meeting at Brown Chapel, and a decision was made about what should we do about his death. James Bevel, who was in this picture, recommended that we actually take his body. James Bevel was always very radical social activist. James Bevel and Hosea Williams were very radical. Andy Young, Congressman Andy Young, and A.D. Abernathy was sort of more moderate. And James Bevel suggested that we take his body, take it to Montgomery, put it on the steps of the Capitol so that the world could see how black people were being treated at that time in Selma, Alabama. A compromise was met because James always had the most radical ideas you'd ever find. And they decided that we would basically organize a march to Montgomery. That is what basically brought about the March to Montgomery. We organized that march. I was a part of that. We marched across the bridge. Bloody Sunday occurred. Dr. King announced inviting people from all over the country to come and to be a part of supporting blacks for civil rights in Selma. People from all over the country came, and he was set up with a dilemma. There was a federal injunction by the federal judge, Frank Johnson, saying, you don't have a right to march. And at that time, the only help we had was the federal government on our side. The state government was totally against us. So Dr. King had to make a decision. Do I violate a federal injunction and possibly lose the support of the federal government, or do I violate this invitation I've given to all these people who come a day's notice from all over the country to come here and support us? He sort of took a half measure. He ended up deciding to march, but his attorney told him, said, Martin, no matter what you do, you cannot march. I don't care, faith saving or what, you can't march. But Dr. King had to do something. So he decided that he would actually have a march, but he went to the bridge, they sat down, and they kneeled down and prayed, then he turned around. That was called Turnaround Tuesday. That caused a great split in the civil rights movement. People like yourselves who were young and idealistic thought that was a betrayal of the civil rights movement. And people like Snick actually went into Lowndes County and stopped supporting the civil rights movement and some of the result of that conflict. But in hindsight, 2 days later, this was on a Tuesday, Turnaround Tuesday. On that Thursday, the federal judge, Frank Johnson, gave us permission to march to Montgomery. And it was that permission that eventually led to the March of Montgomery, which I was on also, and also the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And that was probably one of the most important pieces of legislation to be passed in terms of black life, probably since the Emancipation Proclamation. And that actually came out of Selma, and it was done by people like James Orange and Bernard Lafayette and Dr. King and the people that supported him.
Welcome to the Engaged Memphis Youth Summit.
The mission of engaging voters and staying engaged is absolutely critical.
Recently, more than 300 students attended a youth summit presented by Engage Memphis.
Engage Memphis is a youth-led campaign presented by Facing History and ourselves to engage students in voting.
As soon as you're 18, you have a responsibility to vote.
We need to understand how much we matter in this process.
Make change around my community because I live here and I'm going to have to go through this for the rest of my life.
Students spent their day going through workshops that equipped them to be responsible citizens.
Does anyone have any suggestions on how to do that?
We want to bring a fresh perspective to government.
We need to make a change.
The students came up with a pledge to get Tennesseans re-engaged in voting.
If we all say the pledge together, then it's kind of like a binding agreement with whoever you're with at the time.
So we're excited about it. Our goal is to get at least 1,000 people who had not been voting to vote.
People should listen to what I have to say.
The work that they are doing is essential to our community.
The young people may not be able to vote. They can still advocate for the issues they care about.
Immigration is like a really big part of my life.
We need to make sure that everybody knows how much power they have with their voice, and we also have to make sure that they have an outlet to get their voice out.
To really drive home their message, organizers brought in Charles Mauldin, who, at 17 years old, helped lead the 1965 march.
I don't consider myself a civil rights leader. I sort of consider myself a foot soldier.
The marches from Selma to Montgomery were a series of protest marches that drew civil rights leaders from across the country, including Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
Today marks the beginning of a determined, organized, mobilized campaign.
It's always super inspiring when the older generation is encouraging us to do things our own way.
That's why it's important that you understand how absolutely valuable you are in terms of bringing about social change.
I really enjoyed Mr. Mauldin's speech. It really inspired me. I feel like for the most part, everybody got his message and understood how much he was expecting from us.
I did a little bit of Googling before I got here, and I found out Engage Memphis, the work that you're working on to re-engage voters who are not currently voting. Thank you. That is timely. That is a subject that we all need to be focused on, and you really are leading the way, so I appreciate that. I was talking to Dana over here, and there's really nobody doing that work in Memphis and Shelby County, so we definitely rely on you, and I'm here personally if you need any advice or counsel or just me to show up for something in that process. So it's timely work. The only thing I would have asked is for you guys to get started about 10 years ago, and we might not be in the situation we are today. But that being said, I'm glad you are starting. The struggle for fair and just voting rights obviously continues today. You heard from an amazing speaker earlier this morning about his experience, and the struggle continues today. So just a little stat for you guys. Only 1 in 6 eligible voters actually vote, and only 1 in 500 people actually participate in a political campaign. That means volunteering, contributing money, or anything else. So only 1 in 6 vote that are eligible, and only 1 in 500 people participate in that campaign. So everybody in this room today, when you turn 18, I know you will be one of the 6 people that actually votes but I am hopeful that you'll also be 1 in 500 that gets really involved in campaigns. So last year in Tennessee, voting rights did take a step forward. We, in Tennessee, online voter registration is now possible now. I'm sure you're aware of that. So you can go online, you can register to vote, you can check your registration to vote, which you should before you go vote in Tennessee. And we've had the internet since, what, the 90s, and it only took us this long to make this happen. But that is a step forward. That being said, it was still one step back. So everybody except naturalized American citizens can register to vote online. So if you're an American citizen that happened to be born in another country, you cannot register to vote online in Tennessee. So we took one step forward, but in that way, we're still taking one step back. So it's so important, the work that you're doing, to make sure that we have fair and just laws around voting. Your generation, our generation, can really help turn the tide, because as I said earlier, only 1 in 6 people are voting right now. That is bad, that is abysmal, and I think we're seeing the effects of it. We've seen the degradation of trust in institutions because of it. But that being said, I'm here to talk to you today about my campaign for alderman, and I've also been a part of some campaigns that have successfully reached voters and brought their interests to the forefront. So I know that it can happen, and I know that the people in this room right here are going to make it happen more often. So on to the main subject, something I love to talk about, me. As she mentioned earlier, I did run for office when I was 19. I actually made the decision to run for office in my hometown of Millington while I was a participant in Bridge Builders, and that experience really made up my mind. I know many of you are close to 19. Can I get a show of hands, all the seniors in the room? There we go, yeah. Well, I was going to ask for, all right. I think I heard some high schools back there, so everybody's very excited. So if we could bring it back down for just a second. I will tell you this. Thank you guys, the seniors, for being here. I know that you guys have a lot going on right now. This is a major transition in your life. And I appreciate you being here today and spending your Friday doing this work. I encourage you to stay involved throughout your senior year, which is something that I did not do as a bridge builder my senior year, and I regret not staying more involved, because this experience you cannot have back, and I would encourage you to take advantage of every opportunity you have here. But congratulations to the seniors. So when I ran for office at 19, I was about 8 months removed from graduating high school, so I wasn't much older than you are now. And I ran because I felt like our community needed better representation. I started going to a few Board of Aldermen meetings, and I realized that I had grown up in this city my entire life, yet I did not know a single person that was on the board making the laws and decisions for my community. And I didn't feel like that was right. So started to attend meetings, and I'm just going to sort of take you through the process of how I ran for office, the nuts and bolts of it, really, and then how we were ultimately successful in actually winning that election as a 19-year-old. So to run for office, you have to pull a petition down at Shelby County Election Commission, and you have to get 50 signatures to be put on the ballot. That is the case for every single public office in Shelby County. You have to pull a little petition and get 50 signatures of qualified registered voters. I know that there are more than 50 qualified registered voters in this room right now, so you can get signatures from them. You could walk around to your neighbor's house. It is not hard. I know many of you are probably very active on social media. You've probably gotten 50 retweets or 50 comments or 50 snaps since I've been talking. That is harder to get than 50 signatures to run for office, so it is possible to get on the ballot. Once you get on the ballot, that is when it gets a little bit more difficult. So in my case, I pulled a petition to run for office, and the city that I was running in actually tried to change the law at that time. So at that time, the minimum age to run for office was 18. I was 19. They tried to change the law to 21, so you had to be 21 to run for office. We protested that decision, and we were successful in having them roll back that law. It was a very positive protest, so we showed up. We invited the media, which is a main strategy of that too. If a protest happens and the media is not there to capture it, you're not really accomplishing your goal there. and we were successful in getting it changed. That also served to legitimize my campaign, because if those in power were trying to change the law to keep young people from running, then there must be something to it. That news story about our protest actually not only ran in the Memphis market, but reached as far as Charlotte, North Carolina, Dallas, Texas. But the most important thing was that we were successful in keeping them from passing that law. I say that because it not only allowed me to run for office at that time, but now, 6 years later, I'm finishing up my second term and I won't be running for a third term, but I'm excited to say there is a 20-year-old on the ballot for school board in Millington. And if we had not, yes, please, yeah, round of applause. If we had not gotten involved at that time, he would not be eligible to run for office. So I bring this back around to say the work you're doing here now is not only for the future. We need you now. We need your leadership now. We need you to vote now. And we need you to run for office now. You don't have to wait. I truly believe that. I tell people all the time, I don't think we need an entire city council full of teenagers, although I do think it would probably be ran better. But we do need at least one person representing the interest of teenagers. We make up the largest generation in this city, the largest generation in this country, yet we have the smallest amount of representation. And that is something that we can change starting here today. So after the protest and we were able to stay on the ballots, we then had to actually run a real political campaign. None of us had ever done that at the time, so I got a team together, which was basically my freshman year college roommate, who also went to high school with me, and a couple of my friends from high school who had all had zero political experience. By the end of the campaign, we all had political experience. My campaign manager went on to manage other campaigns. My canvassing coordinator continues to stay involved today. And my treasurer, my freshman year college roommate, Stanton Brown, actually went on, and he's been a treasurer for multiple campaigns, much larger than mine, and stays involved today. So we learned a lot over the course of the campaign, and were ultimately successful. We did that by learning everything we can about what actual political campaigns do. So not, the big strategy things, coming up with messages or anything else, but how do you actually get out and reach voters? And it's not really all that complicated. It hasn't changed for a long time. You knock on doors, you make a lot of phone calls, and you ask people for their votes. I say that because it is possible. Over the course of 6 months of my campaign, we knocked on over 2,000 doors, and eventually we were successful in ousting the longest serving incumbent on the Board of Aldermen with a 19-year-old by a margin of 18%. So it is absolutely possible, and we did it with zero experience moving forward. That being said, we did plan, we did strategize, and I believe that we planned more than my opponent did and strategized more heavily, and I believe that is very important. And we leveraged strategies that only young people at that time really knew about. So our youth was not a disadvantage, it was an advantage. At that time, it was 2012, and we were actually the first campaign in this entire county to use Facebook for advertising for a political campaign. Seems crazy now. Everybody's using Facebook to advertise for political campaigns, even Russia. So it seems crazy now. I know, sorry, I had to sneak that in. But we were actually the first in the county to do it. We were also the first that I know of to use direct text messaging to reach voters, and that was in 2012 in this county. So our campaign was more effective with less than our opponent, and we had a message. We had a message that reached not only young people, we had a message that reached everybody in the community, and our message was pretty simple. We are young, we believe in this community, we have a fresh perspective, and we want to work to make this community better. We brought that message to every single door that we knocked on, every single call that we made, and although we faced a lot of backlash, not even just from elected officials trying to keep us off the ballot, but from everyday people, saying that we were too young to run, that they could not be represented by a 19-year-old or a 20-year-old. Eventually, people, including people much older than me, voted for us. And I think that is not unique to my campaign, and anybody sitting in this room could do that in their community right now. In fact, youth is often an advantage in politics. And you can fact check me if you want, but most of the time, the more youthful candidate is successful, even though the vast majority of voters tend to be much older than us. So our campaign was not particularly different in that way. So we were successful in that campaign. I was able to get elected at 19. I took office at 20. And I'm going to share a little bit about my experience when I was first elected, because it wasn't, it was a great accomplishment being elected. And I thought that meant, since people voted for me to represent their interests, that I could then be effective at representing their interest. It was not the case. When I first got elected, I still had to build credibility, and I tell people this all the time, it was a number of years before I was truly effective in my role. I had to build credibility, I had to build relationships and everything else. I had to build from the ground up. And it really is that sort of inch-by-inch mentality that we have to take into everything we do, whether it be a political campaign, running for office, or building a movement, as you are here today. So I had to build coalitions around issues. I had to go to the public and ask for their feedback on my proposals. And oftentimes that feedback was not, "Good job, Frankie, this is what we want." The feedback was negative. "This is not what we want." And I had to reform and humble myself and represent their interest. And that process, over the course of the last few years, I believe has made me a more effective elected official, and also it's made me more effective in my current job. So I'll take you about 2 years after I was elected. I graduated from Rhodes College, and I was faced with a decision at that point. I had 2 years left in my term. I also had a job offer, a dream job offer in Washington, D.C. After an internship, and I could have stayed in Washington, D.C. at that point and left Millington and just forfeited my last 2 years of my term, and they could have appointed somebody. So I was faced with that decision of whether I should work in D.C. and do this sort of policy work that I wanted to do at that level, or come back home to Millington for a job that pays $2,000 a year and do work on a local level. And the choice to me was clear at that moment. I did want to come home. There's just way too much work to be done here. And trust me, I'm glad every single day that I made that decision, because the work that I've been able to do here in our city, in our county, is so much more meaningful to me. For one thing, I've been able to actually be on the front line of issues instead of just talking about the policies from a 10,000-foot level. The second thing, it's home, and it's home for all of us. So everything I do here means a little bit more to me because it's personal. And I just share that with you because I know a lot of you will probably have to make that decision at some point in your life as well. That didn't make it easier. When I graduated Rhodes, I did not have any job offers in the field that I wanted to be in, doing policy or anything like that. It was, I took a job as a paralegal, wasn't exactly what I wanted to be doing, and I took that opportunity to volunteer on campaigns, to basically work for free for as long as I could, gaining enough experience to where I could actually work in policy and help another candidate win election. I was able to land my dream job at New Memphis and eventually work on Mayor Harris's campaign. So I'm very excited about that trajectory. Thank you. I also ended up, I was never expecting to, run for office again in Millington. I grew up in Millington. I don't know, do we have anybody from Millington in the audience? I love Millington. I wasn't necessarily expecting to spend my entire life in Millington. I was going to do my 4-year term and then call it quits. But in 2016, I did run for re-election in Millington, and I was excited about that and was able to continue doing the work at that level and make sure that some of the stuff that I got started 4 years earlier could continue on. It was a big commitment. And at that time, we brought the same playbook. We knocked on doors. We called people. We brought the same playbook to that campaign and was successful. We got 80% of the vote at that point. So not only is it possible for an average student like me to be elected at 19 and take office at 20, people then voted for me again with 80% of the vote. And I'll say this too, my political ideology is a little bit more progressive than the vast majority of people in my city in Millington. but that did not matter because we did the work and we knew the community and they knew that they could trust me regardless of where our national political views may lie. So it can be done. I say this to, not to boast, although I do love to brag, and brag about myself, but to encourage you because I know I've said it a few times over the course. It is possible for each and every one of you to do this and to run for office if you so choose. But also, there are a number of roles to play that are not running for office. It's working on campaigns. It's doing the work that you guys are talking about doing now and informing voters and encouraging people to register to vote and to vote. Our generation now has the power. We have the numbers. We just have to decide if we have the will to make it happen. And I believe today and the work that you're doing is a great first step. So thank you so much for having me here today.